Welcome back to joffywoodwinds.com, and today I'm going to be spending time with an old colleague, someone who was a fellow student at Juilliard many, many years ago when we were both students of Joe Allard, and I'm very pleased to have long tenured and wonderful clarinetist of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, who's been a sort of a lightning rod for clarinet players throughout this country and the world in presenting new music and new chamber scenarios, just a real force of nature in the clarinet world, Bruce Yeh. So John, thanks so much for participating in this series, and long overdue, and I'm so happy that you have the time today to do that. And
thanks for inviting me, Ed. It's great to see you, and I'm looking forward to our chat together and reliving the old Juilliard days.
Well, you weren't there that long, my friend.
No, I was there for 2 years, and it was a action-packed 2 years, and had a wonderful education there at the Yard, and also just basically being in New York is an amazing education for any musician of any persuasion. So that was a formative part.
Yeah, and especially in the late
for me.
70s, it was so New York was so vibrant musically, and the not only the orchestral world, but the freelance world, the commercial world, and chamber music was exploding.
Oh yes.
Time and so there
A
was
different concert. You could attend, any number of different concerts every night. Carnegie Hall, Alice Tully Hall, Metropolitan Opera, Philharmonic. You had to choose. It was an embarrassment of riches, and just was such an amazing education and opportunity.
Yeah, and you took it. You certainly took advantage of it, and I do remember because you often. I think in my second year there, I was doing a master's when you were completing your bachelor's studies, and I do remember that there was 1 year or one semester where you had the lesson right after me with Joe Allard on Wednesday.
Yeah.
And all I can remember is that I knew that the minute my lesson ended, I had to move out of that chair because you were right on time.
Ready to go.
Exactly.
Ready to roll, to just soak in all that info from Joe.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Very focused and very
I had a lot of work to do. I had a lot of repertoire to go through.
It was very clear that you were very desirous of succeeding in this business, and within a short time you were. And so that's the focus of our interview today. Let's talk about how you grew up. I know you grew up in Los Angeles.
I did.
Your parents were both very accomplished people, scientists who both played musical instruments at a high level. And so how did it come that you picked up the clarinet?
Well, both of my parents are music lovers, and they just had music going in the home at all times. My dad had a great big record collection, and, of course, he inspired me to have a great big record collection, which you can see behind me. I've got 5,000 LPs and almost as many CDs, and I see your CDs there too.
Yeah, that's
and
about
it's
1/10.
Yeah, exactly. So we were bathed in music from our very first days, my two younger sisters and myself, and my parents were real music lovers, but they gave me an education in music too. They exposed me to music, and they took me to concerts. I remember before we moved to Los Angeles, because I was born in Washington, D.C., and we moved to L.A. when I was 2. Before we moved to L.A., they took me to concerts of the National Symphony in Washington. Wow. And it was, it's just part of their DNA to have music in the home and in our lives. So it was sort of like bred into me. And I heard a variety of different kinds of orchestral music, chamber music, vocal music. My dad was a singer, and he conducted choruses when he was young, and then he performed with the Harvard Glee Club with the Boston Symphony when he was at Harvard, doing his doctorate at Harvard in mechanical engineering. So it was a big part of his life. And my mom was a pianist when she was young, had a very strict piano pedagogue from Germany that she always used to Kupka, Herr Kupka, he would come over to my house and make me play Hanon, and she sort of instilled that sense of discipline in me when I was very young. And so they gave me piano lessons when I was 5 years old, and we didn't have, I don't think I had a very good relationship with the piano teacher. She would be this lady that would come to our house, and I don't think we got along because she was very she was very stern. I never remembered her being anything but very, very stern. And so I guess I got discouraged at the piano, and at about the same time, this was when I was 5. So we went to public school in those days, and when we were in second grade, I was 6 years old in second grade. I started school fairly early, and then in the second grade, they offered orchestra instruments to all the students. And wow. I remember there being, an assembly, and all the second graders would kind of go over to the auditorium, and they'd have these instruments sort of lined up, and we'd kind of ooh and ah and kind of poke them. And then I sort of like, this is interesting. And it's this black stick with holes in it and silver keys. And I sort of picked it up, and I kind of like fiddled with it. And, and they said, okay, that's the clarinet. You can play the clarinet. I said, oh, all right.
Just that simple.
Apparently it was that simple. We had sort of this magnetic connection that I sort of like gravitated towards it. And the clarinet said, take me. Yeah. And so I went to my parents, and I said, we were at this assembly today, and I think I'm going to play the clarinet. And they said, fine, good. Then maybe you don't have to take piano lessons anymore. And I thought, oh, phew, good. So they got me piano lessons at they got me clarinet lessons at the local music store. And my actual first clarinet teacher was a gentleman named Gordon Harrott, and he taught at this music store called Musician's Supply Shop. And my parents just said, okay, this is a local music store, and they have a clarinet teacher, so we're going to get you started. I said, okay. And, they rented a clarinet for me. It was a metal clarinet at the time. So I got started, and I sounded terrible, of course, but Mr. Harrott was very patient with me, and he showed me, this is the reed, and this is how you put it on, and and everything. He was very gentle, which was just the opposite of the piano teacher I had. I said, okay. So he drew me in and showed me the basics, and I'm forever grateful to Gordon Harrott for that. He had been well trained as a player, and he had studied with a guy named Glenn Johnston, who was also in L.A. Do you know of Glenn Johnston?
Yeah,
you knew him.
I have some mouthpieces of his. My prime soprano sax mouthpiece is his design. And he was
there you go.
One of those early Disney doublers.
Exactly. And so Gordon Harrott had studied with Glenn Johnston, who in turn had studied with Auguste Perrier in Paris. And then he was in the war, and he lost one leg, and then my Gary Gray also knew Glenn Johnston, and I'd go over to Glenn's house, and he was like an old curmudgeon, and he'd work on mouthpieces, and I'd go with my friend, and we'd kind of like peer from the other end of the room, and he didn't dare get any closer, but he was doing his alchemy. Anyway, he was my first teacher's teacher. And after about 4 years of studying with Gordon Harrott, he said, you have progressed a lot, and I think we should get you another teacher. I've taught you basically all I can, and I think you're good enough to go to a better teacher. And I said, well,
You were how old about this time? About 10?
I was 10.
Okay.
So from the age of 6 to 10, I studied with Gordon Harrott, and he showed me the ropes. And
Now, John, let me just interrupt for a second. 6 years old is quite young to start on a clarinet. Now, were you playing a full-size clarinet at that time?
I was, and it was like this, it was like really
No
big.
strap. No strap.
No strap. Oh, actually, there was a time when I did have a strap. I do remember that, but it wasn't something that I used on a regular basis. It was, here, try this. It doesn't really help one way or another. So, okay, lose the strap and just let's just. And I think when you start that early, there's a lot of time that just getting used to, this is a clarinet, this is a reed, this is a mouthpiece, and it's just like getting the idea. And then my dad, of course, would feed me recordings, and he'd go and he'd find these great recordings. I mean, I don't know how he knew they were great, but he came back with a recording of the Brahms sonatas with Harold Wright. Oh my gosh. And I listened to them. I said, Daddy, this is a clarinet. This is what I want to sound like.
Yeah.
And so he said, yeah, I heard this is good. And then he came back with The Shepherd on the Rock, which was also another Harold Wright. I couldn't figure out how my...
Is that the one with Benita Valente?
Benita Valente, yeah. Rudolph Serkin, and
the other one, and the other one was Harris Goldsmith, right? With the Brahms?
That's right, with Harris Goldsmith, the Brahms sonatas.
You got
classic recordings.
Wow.
I had the best sound in my ear from an early age. Wow. And I have to thank my dad for that, because he knows these recordings out. I have no idea. Maybe he had conversations with Gordon Harrott, and Gordon said, I've heard these recordings, but I never knew about it. I just suddenly got them, and I put them on in my little Philco record player in my room, and I started hearing this amazing sound and beautiful music that spoke to me immediately. And it was like, wow, that's what I want to sound like.
And then, as we'll talk about later, you got a chance to meet one of your heroes and record with him.
That's right. And he became my mentor. Harold, I sought him out. Even before I went to Juilliard, I sought him out, and he eventually became my mentor, which is amazing experience for me, and something that is become part of me. But in between, of course, there was Gary Gray. Well, yeah. And Gary Gray was the teacher that I eventually went to after Gordon Harrott said, you should move on. And my dad said, well, you've been so good for Johnny, and we would like you to continue. He says, then I'm going to double my rate. and my dad said, well, okay, maybe we can look around. And then so he called Mitchell Lurie, who happened to be, like the big clarinet teacher in town at the time.
Sure, he was the big recording guy in L.A.
Big recording guy, and unbeknownst to me, had been principal clarinet of the Chicago Symphony before then. And he talked to my dad, and he said, well, your son is very young, and I'm very busy, and but there's this new guy in town, and his name is Gary Gray, and he's teaching at UCLA now, and he might be very interested in teaching your son. And so my dad said, thank you very much, and he calls up Gary Gray, and Gary Gray says, I think I have time to teach your son. And it turns out that Gary Gray lived half a block from us on our street. It couldn't have been more of that should have been a huge, and it was a huge, serendipity at the moment. Yeah. And it was like, oh, okay, it took me 30 seconds to get to his house, pick up my clarinet and go there. And we'd have lessons. And of course, after about a year and a half, he moved further away, so we had to drive to his house. But by then I was I was hooked. This guy really was not only a beautiful player, and he'd play things for me, and he'd show things to me. This is how it's done, and he'd explain everything. And he was just as gentle as Gordon Harrod, but at the same time, he was also challenging me to do things that I would never have thought I could do at that point. So he was an amazing psychologist, as well as being a great performer and technician on the instrument. So, and of course, incredibly versatile, as saxophone, flute, all the clarinets. And he said, you should be open-minded and try the bass clarinet and try the E-flat clarinet. And so I took those opportunities when they came up, and he was the one that said, youth orchestras, So, and my dad, bless his heart, would make all these calls he'd call, I was in the Mount St. Mary's youth symphony for like when I was 10, and we'd rehearse during the summers at Lionel Newman's garage. And Lionel Newman was a big, Hollywood composer at that time, and his two sons, who are now big Hollywood composers, David and Tommy Newman, played violin in this little orchestra, and we would rehearse with Dr. Duran, who was a flute teacher in town, who eventually became my sister's flute teacher. And Dr. Duran would go through, like Russian Sailors Dance and Dvorak's, New World Symphony and all those, standards. And we'd just kind of like get these pieces in our ear. And then my dad said, I've heard that there's the American Youth Symphony, and they just rehearse up the hill here at UCLA. We live, a mile from UCLA. And he said, the American Youth Symphony is conducted by Meli Mehta, and that's Zubin Mehta's father. And I said, Zubin Mehta, that sounds familiar. Yeah, Zubin Mehta is the conductor and the music director of the Los Angeles Philharmonic. Oh yeah, you took me to see a concert of them when I was 6. Yeah. I remember them taking me to the opening of the Dorothy Chandler Music Center when they moved in there, and the LA Philharmonic played a series of concerts, including remember this, the Don Quixote by Strauss, and I still have the programs of that. And I said, so Zubin Mehta, that conductor, his father is a conductor too? Yeah. So he came, and he was the most energetic musician and conductor and taskmaster, old style, but still he had such music and, nurturing in his heart. So he taught this generations of musicians. And when I joined the orchestra, I was 13. And I was the youngest by far in that orchestra, and I just kind of sat at the end of the clarinet section and soaked it all up. So he was Gary Gray was colleagues with Meli Mehta because they both taught at UCLA, and so this was my original musical training upbringing.
Yeah, and what you've laid out, John, is almost textbook for what you would hope a talented person would have available to them. The support of your parents, who were not only smart about things, but brought you to concerts, got you, and had music at home, and found the right type of teachers for you. And of course, finding someone like Gary Gray, who is, not only one of the loveliest people one could have imagined. We lost Gary last year.
Yes.
I hope anyone watching this video might also go back to the interview I did with Gary roughly about a year before he passed away, and just one of the great people, and certainly the most giving person.
So generous.
In every way, and not only in music, in every way, and supportive colleague is the best way. But so and then having all these opportunities that your dad found out about and brought to you. So I think it speaks to the fact that in getting young people hooked on music, you need the support at home, you need the support in the schools. The schools have to
Absolutely.
offer that the opportunities, and then and just allowing young people to be at concerts, to experience it without any preconceived prejudices.
Hmm.
Children of any type will love almost any music if it's presented in a positive way, and that's certainly the problem I think we've had of the last 2 or 3 generations with classical music not being made as available in the schools as it had been in mid 20th century America.
Hmm.
And certainly when generations of people who became parents not having had the exposure to it, and certainly mass media doesn't give us that exposure. But I think any child having that type of an exposure with parental support and or support at the school, good things are going to happen.
And we are coming back to that. Today, I am participating in the Chicago Youth Music Festival, and our music director, Riccardo Muti, is going to conduct an orchestra of 150 musicians from all over the country, interspersed with members of the Chicago Symphony and the Chicago Civic Orchestra and alumni. And so we are tonight going to have an open rehearsal with Maestro Muti, and we're going to do the piece that this youth orchestra has been working on all weekend. And so this is an initiative that musicians and musical organizations like the Chicago Symphony and music schools and community music schools are stepping up and taking the model, for example, that the El Sistema, which is so successful in Venezuela and has produced the current music director of the LA Philharmonic, Gustavo Dudamel. And it's just one of those things that sparks the interest and the imagination of the young person. And then once they get that spark, they go, they take it and they run and they find their own resources and they gather with their own peers. And that was another major part of my education. Was I had peers, colleagues in the American Youth Symphony at school in University High School in LA who loved music as much and maybe even more than I did at the time. Because my parents always thought, you're going to always have music, but you're going to have to study the sciences to be able to make a career and a success. That was sort of their mindset, that I would have music as an enjoyment and an enrichment, and I would have a career in the sciences. So that was my mindset all the way through high school into college.
Right, and you enrolled at UCLA as a sort of a pre-med.
Pre-med. I was a pre-med major at UCLA. I studied biology, physics, chemistry, calculus, all of those things that you do when you prepare to go to medical school. And I, at the same time, participated in all the musical organizations, the symphony orchestra, the chamber orchestra, the chamber music ensembles, because my teacher taught there and I was taking private lessons with him. And my youth orchestra director taught there, Meli Mehta. So it was like synergy. It was like I had all this wonderful exposure to the high level of music performance and music education. And I have to say, it washed over me in such a way that it was occupying all my attention. Every spare moment, I said, "Oh, you want to do a Beethoven quintet? Okay, let's get together. Let's see. Okay, after school we're going to do this," and we rehearsed it, and I would just love that. And I would sort of dutifully do my calculus homework at night, and turn in and get pretty good grades, but then I came to the point in my education where I actually thought to myself, gosh, every spare moment, I'm listening to recordings of the Juilliard Quartet playing the Debussy Quartet and Beethoven Opus 131, and I'm listening to Harold Wright and watching the Boston Symphony every moment they're on TV, and it's like, I think this is really what I want to do. So after 2 years at UCLA, I went to the counselor there and I said, I've been thinking of transferring and possibly applying to music schools, because there are a few music schools that have really good reputations. Like there's Curtis and there's Juilliard and there's Boston University, where my idol teaches, where Harold Wright. And so they said, well, music is very competitive, and only maybe 1/10 of 1% really makes it to the level that you are aspiring to. I said, I think I'm aware of that, but you know what? I think this is really what I love to do. And they said, well, it sounds like it's your passion. So, and I've done my homework too. In those days, there was no internet, obviously. Right. So I wrote away to these places, and I got catalogs, and I opened them, right. And there were pictures of, Harold Wright teaching and the Juilliard Orchestra rehearsing. And it was like, and the building of Lincoln Center where the Juilliard School was. And it was like, wow, this is exciting. I could go for this, and I really want to give it a try. So one day at dinner, I went to my parents, and I'd done up my homework. I had this stack of catalogs, and I said, you know what? I talked to the counselor at UCLA, and I'm thinking of applying to music school. And this was already after I'd been to 2 summer festivals at Idlewild, which was when I was in high school, and at Aspen, which is where Gary Gray taught during the summers. Right. And people were telling me, you're so talented, and where are you going to go to college? And I said, well, I'm going to UCLA, and I'm going to go to medical school. And they said, what? They said, how can you let your talent fall by the wayside? They said, you should go and really, really concentrate on a musical education. And they said, you can always go to medical school later. And I said, well, okay. And I thought about the more and more I'd have experiences, it would just fill me with joy to play, a Brahms quintet with a string quartet. And I did that when I was in high school, and I was like, gosh, I can't understand not doing this for my life. So that's when I said, after these experiences and after doing my homework on that, I went to my parents and I said, I'm thinking of applying to music schools. And they kind of looked at each other and they said, well, we want you to be happy. And if you do your best, we will support you. And that was the best gift my parents ever could have given me. And it was, ultimate support. And they said, follow your heart's desire, we don't want you to follow our plan for you just because it happens to be what we think is right for you. I think we want you to do what you want to do and do your best at it. And so that, for me, was the turning point. And I was like, I have my parents' blessing, and on top of that, their financial support. They were gonna pay for me to go to music school. And I said, this is so amazing. And that fired me up even more. And Gary Gray, already had when I was 2 years before that, he was saying, when you're ready to go to college, I'll support you wherever you want to go, whether you want to go to university or to a conservatory or what. And I had to tell him, I said, well, I'm going to go study pre-med. And he said, okay, that's fine too. It's like, he was like, but I'm going to do everything that you want me to do for you. And I'm going to show you the path on how to do it best. So I had so much great support.
You really had a very strong support system. As good as one can imagine, as good as I've ever heard anyone having.
Yeah.
So
I'm so fortunate.
now you're at Juilliard, and I do remember because there were you and Tom Aber were
Oh
the
yeah.
bass clarinetists at the time there, and Dennis Smiley had just, I think, graduated.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
certainly for me, hearing these wonderful bass clarinetists, but I do remember in one particular year there were several auditions, one of which was Chicago. I think maybe L.A. was in it
Yep.
around that
Well,
time.
LA had an audition for bass clarinet during my first year at the Juilliard School, which was in 1975. And I said, "Oh, great, I'm gonna go." And so I went and I applied. And in those days, they didn't have a screen, so they knew exactly who you were. And they said, "We know him." And so I got there, and I played all my excerpts, and I saw their expressions, and okay, we used to know him, but gosh, he sounds pretty good. And they come up to me afterwards and they said, "You're really on the right track. You should keep doing this and keep taking auditions." And it was like they gave me a boost, but they told me, maybe it's not quite time, but you're on the right track. So that was a very good piece of information. And then the following year, there was the Vancouver Symphony, the Cincinnati Symphony, and the Chicago Symphony. Three big bass clarinet auditions. And then in between there was an audition for the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra, the principal clarinet position of the St. Paul Chamber Orchestra. And I'd known the music director, who was Dennis Russell Davies. And Dennis, I had had a chance to work with him at Aspen in 1974, before I went to Juilliard. So he remembered me, and I of course remembered him, and I was pumped. I said, "This is great because I love chamber music. I want to be principal. Bass clarinet can wait for the moment." And so I went and auditioned at St. Paul, and it was I felt so good. I got to play with the wind quintet. I played all the big chamber Beethoven symphonies, Ginastera variations, all this stuff that was for chamber orchestra. And they said, "Okay, we'll call you." And it's like, okay. And I waited and waited and waited. And then the next morning, Dennis calls me. And he says, "We were really impressed by your audition." And of course, played the Mozart concerto. He said, "You're so virtuosic and musical. But we decided to give the job to somebody that had some experience." And I said, "Oh, you know, this is really what," he said, "I know you're going to be," he said, "First of all, don't you want to play symphonic music? Don't you want to be in a big orchestra?" I said, "Yeah, but chamber music, I just love it." And he said, "You mark my words, you're going to be in a big symphonic orchestra very soon." He says, "We would be holding you back if we gave you this job." I said, "Oh, Dennis, I don't think so." And he said, "You mark my words." And the next month, I was in the Chicago Symphony Orchestra because I had an opportunity. I'd been preparing my bass clarinet auditions.
Well, now, but this brings up a point that I wanted to ask you. You were auditioning on bass clarinet. He auditioned on principal for St. Paul. You're keeping, I mean, these audition lists are different, and the
Yeah,
demands are different. And so
yeah,
keeping both of these instruments up, and A and B flat clarinets, bass
yeah.
clarinet up, and working this, I mean, you really must have been practicing night and day. I mean, because no matter how gifted one is, these are very different instruments, and the
Yep.
repertoire is different, different demands. How did you go about maintaining your levels on both of these different instruments?
Well, in those days, living in New York City and going to Juilliard, I had lots of energy. I was energized by everything that I saw. Nowadays, I'm a little bit
Well,
lazy,
John, let me correct you there. I heard your recital about a month ago that
Oh,
I heard of. You have plenty of energy.
well, it's also a matter of time management because now, that recital, by the way, has resulted in, it was like a warm up for my next recording project, which is now all recorded and in the can, waiting to be edited and released in the spring of 2023. And it's called Chicago Clarinet Classics, and that was a pandemic project. So we had a complete lockdown, the whole world locked down in the spring of 2020, and I suddenly found myself with all this time and stacks of music that I'd never played before, but always hoped to. And so I started chipping away at music, and then one thing led to another, and I formulated this project with my recording company here in Chicago, CD Records, and that became that was the impetus to use my time very well. And when I was in elementary school, my teachers would always say, he doesn't really make the best use of time. He fools around a lot. And it was like, now, I have learned a lot, and I've learned a lot from, I'm getting old now, and through my years, I've learned so much. And now my motto is balance is the key to life. And so I balance, my physical health with my mental health, with my musical development, with my family, with everything. It's like everything has to be in perfect balance to be optimum. So I've learned a lot from my wife, Teresa, who's a fine musician and educator and a clarinetist in her own right. And by the time you hear this, she will be on the faculty with me at Roosevelt University. We're just about to announce that. And so that's a very, very exciting new project for me to be team teaching at a university with my wife. We've team taught before, but it's always been sort of like on a private basis with high school students. And so that's very exciting. And so I've learned a lot by living with and making music with Teresa to how to balance my life. And I've learned a lot from my kids. My two older daughters are both professionals in culinary, and my middle daughter is a Juilliard graduate, Molly, and she, is a percussionist. And I learned from a very early age, when Molly started taking percussion in 4th grade and then going through high school, that percussionists have to be very organized, because they deal with hundreds of instruments, and we deal with 4 or 5 instruments, and I think that's a lot. But that's nothing for the percussionist, and how to get things from one end of an instrument to another, playing a marimba and stuff. They have to be so ultimately organized. So now Molly is a Food Network TV personality, and she is still a very high quality musician that is qualified to play percussion, in any great ensemble. But she is so organized that she's able to write books, write a blog, do a TV show, take care of 2 young kids. It's like I sit back and marvel at that. And then I think to myself, it was all I could do to just learn an audition list. But I was so driven that was kind of the singular project for me. Yeah. And I also had I lived on 74th Street, 51 West 74th Street, right off between Columbus and Central Park West, in this brownstone. And my landlady was very strict. Anytime I'd make a peep, I'd start to practice in my room, she'd call and she said, "What is that noise I'm hearing?" "Oh, please, I gotta practice." She says, "You know what? Let me do something for you. We have a basement here, and the super lives in the basement. Let me ask him if he would mind if you practice down in the sub-basement." And the guy said, he was very hard of hearing anyway. So she said, "Yeah, that guy doesn't mind if you practice." So I said, thank you. And so I would be there all night every night. I'd go down there, and there were like water bugs and dust and boxes of stuff. Water bugs are huge roaches,
Right. Well,
as
we're
you
just
know.
talking about a basic New York apartment now.
Yeah, but I had the fortune that I could have my bass clarinet and my clarinets down here and practice at all hours of the night, and so I would, and I'd have my scores to, Ein Heldenleben and Don Quixote and the Miraculous Mandarin, all the things that were on the list, and I'd study my scores and I'd practice the parts and I'd actually be drawn in by this process. And before I knew it, it was like 3 o'clock in the morning. I said, gosh, I got an 8 o'clock class. I better get to some sleep. So that was my energetic output. During that time, I was singularly focused on getting ahead. And then at night, before I practiced, I'd go to Carnegie Hall and catch the Boston Symphony on tour and listen to my idol. Then I'd come home and I was so pumped up that I would go down and try to play, Beethoven 6 just the way Harold did, and it wouldn't quite come out right. So I'd have to, it was just a singular focus.
Right. And, it reminds me a great deal of what many of the jazz players in the certainly the 70s were doing. Many of them would go down and would get lofts, and they would be, several of them would join in and rent space in a loft and play all day and night in order to just be able to do that. And so you had that not in the loft, but in the sub basement.
No, sub basement. I was lucky in that for that.
I'm not sure I know of anybody in a major five, let's say one of our major orchestras, go from the bass clarinet position in that same orchestra to an associate principal position. I mean, that's quite an unusual scenario. How did that evolve for you?
It is very unusual, and it just happened to work out for me that when I joined the Chicago Symphony in 1977, it was the available position, because you sometimes have to wait a lifetime for a position to become available in a major orchestra. And I just happened to be there at the right time and be honing my skills with one of the great, bass clarinetists of all time, Joe Allard, and knowing the material. And I applied and I went, and I just happened to be, have worked it up and fit my style of playing with the Chicago Symphony at the time. And Sir George Solti, who was music director, hired me. And in those days, I have to say, it was easier to get into a great orchestra like that, because there weren't as many qualified applicants. There weren't as many applicants to begin with. And even though you sometimes had to wait an entire lifetime for somebody to retire, in this case, die. My predecessor died suddenly. George Weber was the bass clarinetist of the Chicago Symphony, and you just have to be ready for a situation like that. So I was honing my skills, and I had my so I went, tried out, got in, and then the end of my first year, the principal clarinetist at the time, Clark Brody, announced his resignation, and he was retiring from the orchestra. And the very young, and he was my mentor at the time when I joined the orchestra, Larry Combs, was the E-flat clarinet player and assistant principal, and he playing a lot of principal clarinet. I heard him several times at Carnegie Hall with the Chicago Symphony when they'd come on tour, and he had worked with Harold Wright, so they were sort of cut from the same cloth, at Marlborough. So Larry and I became very close, and he mentored me, and he says, after I moved to principal, and he just moved up to principal because he had auditioned very recently for the Chicago Symphony. He'd been in the Chicago Symphony for 3 or 4 years by the time I got there, and Solti knew him and wanted him to be principal. So then there was the opening for assistant principal, and I said, gosh, I'd really love to play principal on some of the parts here. And so they gave me a possibility to do that, and Larry assigned me some principal parts in like some concertos and things like that. And I got used to it, and I thought, gosh, this is this is great, but I love playing the bass clarinet. You know, those days we were making a lot of recordings. So I got to record big parts on the bass clarinet, you know, Mahler 5, Mahler 6, Mahler 7, pictures at an exhibition, you know, a new piece by Michael Tippett. I played all these bass clarinet, you know, parts on recordings, and I really got into it, and videos with all the Strauss tone poems with Schulte and stuff like that. And suddenly there's an opening for E flat. So I was in a quandary. I thought, gosh, you know, I love the bass clarinet. I really want to play principal. Maybe there's a way I can do both. So I said, would you guys allow me to play bass clarinet and assistant principal in the orchestra? And they said, well, we're going to have to ask the members committee about that. So they went to the members committee and they said, you know, we don't think that would be really good because, first of all, it'd be setting a strange precedent for this orchestra. We have a complement that was formed in 1962 in the contract, and the complement lists every position in the orchestra. And there's principal clarinet, there's second clarinet, there's assistant principal, which includes E flat, and there's bass clarinet. And we cannot change that complement because it's memorialized in the contract. Right. So your choices are this: stay on bass clarinet or audition for assistant principal and learn the E flat. So I said, I thought about it long and hard, and I had chats with Larry, and Larry said, look, you know, I think you should try the E flat. And he gave me his E flat clarinet, his mouthpiece, his reeds and everything. And he said, I'm gonna let you, you know, come and play for me and learn all the excerpts. And bless his heart, he prepared me for the audition. And I had an internal audition, and I went and played all the big E flat excerpts, and they saying, wow, you know, this guy's a great bass clarinet player, but he knows the E flat stuff too. And then I played, you know, a couple of Beethoven symphonies and the Miraculous Mandarin on first clarinet, the Mozart concerto, and they said, they went away for a few minutes and they came back and they said, sure, if you want to move up, you can. And that sort of thing is so, could probably not happen these days.
It's unheard of.
It was in the right place at the right time that I did that.
You know, you also, something came up here that I wasn't aware of. Larry Combs sounds like one of the great colleagues that one could have, and how fortunate that you were there with someone like that.
Yes.
Because we've heard of other types of colleagues who would be anything but supportive,
right,
and would actually be negative. I mean, so I think we've talked about so many of your positive influences growing up with your parents, your teachers, your educational situation, and how much that encouraged you. But here, entering an orchestra, major orchestra at 19, and having a colleague like Larry Combs extend himself to you like that.
Oh,
John, I think if you play the lottery, I'd want to go in with you.
I have been many times blessed in my professional and my personal life, and I'm thankful every moment of every day for the, you know, the life I've had. And so I've had the good fortune to work with 3 different principal clarinetists in the Chicago Symphony that have all been absolute beautiful colleagues. Clark Brody, Larry Combs for the longest time, Steve Williamson, my current principal in the Chicago, all wonderful musicians, wonderful colleagues. And so I've been very, very lucky from that point of view. And they've all given me opportunities to do what I'd like to do in the best way possible. So I'm so thankful. And Larry, you know, ushered me into the job that he was leaving to do E flat and assistant principal. And so I moved up several octaves, and at the same time, you know, we had a bass clarinet vacancy for about 3 years. And so anytime something would come up that had both E flat and bass, Larry would say to me, you know, you can just choose whichever part you wanted to play. So, you know, there was one time when we did till Eulenspiegel, and I said, well, I've already recorded that with Schulte, so I'd like to play, the piccolo clarinet part on till Eulenspiegel. Oh, fine, that's great. So we'd hire an extra to play bass clarinet, and then there was, I guess, a couple of other pieces like Daphnis and Chloe, and I'd like to play bass clarinet in this, so we hired somebody to play E flat, and then other parts I had my pick of whether to play E flat or bass for several years because we had several auditions to fill the position that the bass clarinet position. So finally we got Laurie Bloom, and then we were a complete section for 26 years. I mean, it was a long time when we had 4 clarinets all hired by Schulte.
Yeah.
We were the longest.
Again, that's an unusual circumstance that you found yourself in, one not likely to occur, certainly not in a major symphony orchestra like Chicago. Let me sort of step aside in another way. You've practiced, obviously, for auditions, and you've done that. You've practiced to prepare music for regular concert series. You've also practiced. You did competitions in the '80s. We were prize winners in both Munich and Naumburg, and practicing for that. How does your practice routine change in any way radically? Obviously, the musical situations, the specific pieces will dictate some things. But do you make any changes also, I should mention, as a concerto soloist, where you've played Nielsen and Carter concertos with Chicago? I mean, does your practice routine change in any radical way for these various scenarios you found yourself in over your career?
It does. It changes radically from project to project, sometimes from week to week. This week, by the way, we are playing a very interesting program that starts rehearsing tomorrow. We're going to do the Firebird Ballet, the entire Stravinsky Firebird, which I always play the D clarinet now, which is the piccolo clarinet, and that's with third clarinet and D clarinet. So I've had to brush that up. There's a great history with that piece in our orchestra too, because we've recorded that and done videos with Boulez. You can find that on YouTube. That's a really cool one to watch. The Boulez.
Is this
the original
orchestration? Yeah.
Yeah, 1910 Firebird. So we're doing that. We're revisiting that piece this week. So I'm brushing that up. Plus, we're doing a brand new piece by I think he's a Swedish composer by the name of Anders Hillborg, and I'm playing contrabass clarinet in that. So we just had our big giant paperclip renovated by a guy here named Matt Bordoshuk. That he's done a great job on overhauling this contrabass that we had. So I'm excited to play that, and then I'm going to play principal clarinet in the Prokofiev second violin concerto on the same program. So I have to juggle from different registers, starting with the Hillborg on contrabass, moving up to principal on the Prokofiev, and then moving way up to piccolo clarinet in the Stravinsky. So that's the sort of thing that I relish. I just love having the opportunity to be versatile, but of course it pushes me because I have to, first of all, get 3 different kinds of reeds ready, and just really put in the time and the effort and the energy to be able to make these things happen. And then, as you mentioned, when I have a concerto or a recital or a competition, then of course it's absolute. And then if I have to do orchestra on top of that, the number one name of the game is efficiency. So it's like there are certain things that I know are going to go fine. So I don't waste time. I only focus on the things that are really like giving me trouble, and kind of like try to work those details out. And then hopefully the whole thing will kind of come together. So I've had to. And you mentioned the competitions that I've done, and those are some of the hardest work that I've ever had to do, because to perform in a competition often means that you have to perform like 11 different. I remember at Munich I had to prepare 11 different pieces, and I had maybe performed a handful of them before, but a lot of them I'd never played before. So I had to bring those things up and study them. A lot of the preparation is just studying scores, is just opening the score and seeing how everything lines up and how things go with, and and how to shape phrases and how they sound, and just building a plan for it is so important. And now I think even more so in my current situation in my career, I play a little bit less and I study a little bit more. And that I think has become sort of the norm for me, because I don't want to wear myself out and, get fatigued, because I might get fatigued a little bit sooner now than I did when I was 19. So in those days, I used to just hit the instrument and continue playing and playing and playing. Now I've had to learn to be more efficient and just kind of like focus in on certain things, maybe just an interval, and study more about, see how pieces line up. Like, when I'm learning a new piece, and I had to learn 6 new pieces for the album that I just recorded. And I just spent a lot of time, and thank goodness this was one of the silver linings of the Corona cloud, that I had the time to do that, and to undertake a project like a recording of pieces that I had to learn from the ground up takes time.
Right. I mean, it sort of sounds a little bit like the way great jazz players evolve, that especially ones with great technical facility, that over time, as they move into their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, they play maybe fewer notes, leave a little more space in their solos. And maybe what they're playing, therefore, sometimes makes more compositional sense and maybe has more of an emotional
Yep.
strain to it. But it's very interesting that you approach your work like that. Now, let me
Yes.
ask you, based on what you have coming up in this concert series, which do you tend to want to practice the lower instruments before the upper, or vice versa? Do you have any feelings in that regard?
I do practice the lower instruments first. And well, first of all, in this particular case, because the contrabass is less familiar to me than the D clarinet. They're both less familiar than the B flat A and the E flat, but the contrabass is an instrument that we used to take on tour all the time in the 1990s. We could never go on tour without taking the contrabass clarinet. When Daniel Barenboim was our music director, we used to either play the Corigliano Symphony or the Schoenberg Five Pieces for Orchestra, or pieces written for us by Takemitsu, and we just take these pieces on tour. And the stage crew, bless their hearts, would always have to get the big trunk for the contrabass, but it's not used as much so much recently, except for this season. We have 2 pieces. The first being the Philip Glass Symphony Number 11, which I had to dust off the contrabass for about a month ago. And then I found out that, this instrument is not in very good shape. So we have to get it out and get it back in time. It had been overhauled now, and it's much better shape now. So this Hilborg is coming up this week, and that's much more athletic than Philip's Symphony was. So it'll be interesting. And then to get back into the D clarinet on the Firebird, I know the way it's supposed to go. I know the problem spots, and so I zero in on them.
Right. Yeah, that's it. That's interesting. It also, in a way, going back to an interview I did a couple of seasons back with Stanley Parker, I asked him about that, because Stanley was always, throughout his career, very involved in playing chamber music anywhere. I mean, he just took every opportunity to do that. And I said, well, how is it, of course, the concerto playing that he would often do, how is it that you would go week to week and be able to focus? And he would say that, he would have his read routine. He'd have his reads for the next week going the week before, and he would only practice those things that he felt needed to be addressed So
Right.
again, there I think there's someone who clearly made use of efficiency in his career.
Efficiency. It's
You
the
know,
name of the game.
it's a great.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you regarding all of this: what uh, warm-up routines or what exercises from whatever great pedagogical studies do you still find after all these years so valid, so important to you to maintain, keep your levels up?
hmm Well, very, very simple uh, exercises like intervals, difficult intervals to try to connect them. Very simple, like 5-note scales to be able to get evenness. And basically, at this point, it's getting selection of reeds that are going to be able to do the task required. So we live in an environment where the weather changes a lot from day to day, and so we have to be ready for those changes to affect our reeds. And so that's one of the things that I spend most of the time in practicing and warming up to get the reeds warmed up for that particular day. And I think there's and I've over the years had a couple of books that have been very helpful, and one of them is the Yetudes that were created by Jim Stevenson for me.
Huh.
I mean, they're these, and the picture of this is my daughter Molly's. Uh,
Is that from her
re-
cookbook?
yeah, it's from her. It's from her blog. MyNameIsYeh.com. And so Jim Stevenson, uh, is a very, very wonderful composer, but he's also very witty word craftsman. So he did Yetudes to be, and then he's so clever because each one of the Yetudes is based on a different recipe. So this one is funfetti pony pinata cake. That's the cover.
Well, wait a
and
minute, wait
and
a minute. Let me see that again. That doesn't look like so much fun with every note being articulated there.
I know, and each one of these Yetudes focuses on a different aspect of clarinet technique and clarinet challenges. So this is the funfetti pony pinata cake, and then the first one is a cat cake, and then there's the molten halva lava cake that is slowly flowing molten legato, like that. And then there's high there's frosted red velvet cakes, you know, and it's just like very, very smooth legato going through.
I don't gather there's a halava cake.
There's
Oh,
halva, there's molten halva lava cake.
all
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
Halva lava cake. And then of course there's the okay, this is cool. This is strawberry hi-hat cupcakes. So this has an optional hi-hat
Oh, I
cymbal
see.
part.
You're supposed to play that with your left leg, I assume, right?
Yeah, play it with my daughter. That's the idea. And
There you go.
and then there's very high staccato, the marzipan blueberry cake.
Ah,
So I provided Jim with the suggestions for the different challenges, and he created the music based on the titles from Molly's recipes.
right.
And so that became one of the things that I was able to keep during the pandemic. I mean, these are difficult. So during the pandemic, I had a chance to really delve into these and get to know them. And then there's the
Is this book available online?
yes. Oh, absolutely. It is available at www.composerjim.com, which
Okay.
is Jim Stevenson's website.
Okay. Excellent.
That's Jim,
Well,
me and Jim, and yeah, and so he's been a great friend and colleague and resource over the years, and of course my project that was released most recently by CD Records is 74 minutes of clarinet music by Jim Stevenson, including his clarinet concerto called Liquid Melancholy. So this is one thing of my previous recording project, and then the upcoming recording release is going to be Chicago Clarinet Classics. So I've been able to use the time that I've been away from orchestra. We were on lockdown for, better part of a year. And so I was able to take the time, it's found time. And so was able to get to know Jim's 8 etudes and to get to know 6 new pieces for Clarinet Classics.
Well, that speaks also to your involvement over the years in new music and certainly in chamber music, as you were the founder of Chicago Pro Musica, which has been a hugely successful chamber group, multiple Grammy winner. John, this speaks to the fact of something you alluded to earlier, that one, in order to function on a high level as a professional, and especially in today's world, and if you have a great deal of passion for making music of a lot of styles, you have to be incredibly organized and focused. And and there are so many more distractions today than perhaps when we met at school. I mean, certainly the internet and social media and the responsibilities one has now with the orchestras and trying to promote the orchestras within a community. The amount of focus and organizational skills one has to have is as important, it seems, almost as one's musical skills.
It is true. And like I say, my biggest challenge is scheduling, but at the same time, the efficiency with which one parses their time and also the support system that one must have and the colleagues all work together to create a constellation for one's success. I think it cannot happen in a vacuum. You have to have inspiration from colleagues, which I get every day from my colleagues in the Chicago Symphony. Wisdom and inspiration from family, which I get every day from my spouse, from my beautiful and talented wife, Teresa, and from my kids. It's just like from my students. I currently have 6 students that I teach at the Roosevelt University, and I learn from them every day. And so it's a matter of being open-minded and efficient, and just seeing how the different parts can work together in harmony. And I think it's really a good thing to be able to have all that happen in harmony.
Right. Now, obviously a committed music educator at carrying forward the examples that someone like Gary Gray, your mentor, set for you. What are the materials that you sort of want all of your students to cover, in their college years? I mean, what are the essential pedagogical materials and repertoire that you sort of insist that your students be exposed to?
Right. Well, I believe in a balanced diet, and this is what Gary always espoused also. You want to have a very strong grounding in orchestra music because that's where the majority of our repertoire comes in. So everybody has to be on the track to study all the important orchestra parts, and you want to be able to know all the important chamber music pieces, which are some of the greatest achievements in art. And they happen to be written for our clarinet, for our instrument. And then there's the solo repertoire. And then in order to have the tools to be able to create success on those things, you need to target the individual challenges that individual students are up against. So some of my students have absolutely natural sound qualities, and you don't want them to change a thing with their tone. It's like, play that way and beautiful. Others have real challenges with creating a sound and keeping the pitch on and things like that. So you have to target the individual needs of the individual student. And I think that is important to have the recognition of what the needs of a particular student are. So that's why I'm so excited with our program at Roosevelt, at the Chicago College of Performing Arts, that we have that ability now to have a team teaching approach where Teresa and I will be able to evaluate and teach to each individual student's needs and desires. And I think it's much better that way than to have a template that every student must follow. So I take into account what the student imparts to me. It's like, oh, you want to play the Brahms Quintet? Oh, okay, we'll work on that. Oh, you want to play the the Bernstein Sonata? Okay, we'll work on that. But in order to do that, you have to work on this particular aspect of your articulation. So we're going to go to this particular yetude, and we're going to check that articulation out. So you get a toolbox that creates an environment for success. And then we need to build a plan how to make the music effectively speak to the listener. So it is a multifaceted approach and a balanced diet. And I think the more we can be flexible and the more we can be open, and each student has something individual to say. Each musician has something individual to say. And so it is our job as educators to be able to bring the best so that student has the success that he or she needs to be able to be their best communicator and their best musical spokesperson through their instrument. And I believe strongly in that experimentation and feedback is very, very important for each. And I sort of like, I reject any rigid approach. It has to be fluid, it has to be sensible, and most of all, it has to be communicative. You have to communicate the story. And then you put the pieces in place and gain the tools to be able to do all that most effectively. And I think the talent that we have coming up these days is tremendous. It's like there's no shortage of talent in young musicians. It's to be able to channel the talent and to nurture the talent and to bring the best out in that individual that's going to be able to give them success and hopefully give them a lot of satisfaction along the way.
Right. Yeah. Well, in much of what you've just said reminds me a little bit of Joe Allen's approach to each.
Absolutely.
There was no. I mean, sometimes to the extent where I would just say, "Please tell me what to do. Tell me what system." Because what did you want? You bring it in, and then from there he would go, and the lesson would build off of that.
Exactly, and that's the approach that I have adopted also because I find it's very successful. And a student may require more guidance than another student, and some students are much more self motivated as well as self diagnostic, and that is, for me, that's the ultimate in success, is when a teacher can help a student be his or her own teacher. And that's where I find really, really satisfaction in when I see my students go on and become their own teachers.
Exactly. And I would imagine there are times when you might use some Rose etudes or Bamman studies or class
Absolutely.
to bring some difficulties into focus and to concentrate.
The basics are the Rose studies, the 40 studies, the Rose 32 etudes, and the I like the Cavallini caprices. They're just something that Gary Gray got me started on.
Mentioned, if you're going to deal with Cavallini caprices, like Bob Marcella said, the Riccardi edition, RICORDI.
Yes, Riccardi edition. Yes, but you know what? In my experience, you can take music like that, like operatic music, and make it your own, no matter what articulations you use. But you want to be able to do it effectively, to be able to communicate the story and to tell the story. And the story doesn't have to be the same from one day to another or from one player to another. It can be a completely different story, but it has to be a story.
Exactly. I want to just one or two more questions in this interview that I'm curious about. You've talked glowingly, obviously, about Harold Wright, but were there others, and have there been other esteemed players who you look to as role models in the way they evolved as musicians and as clarinetists?
Of course. Well, one of the great teachers that I have to mention and credit is Michel Zukovsky, who was the principal clarinetist of the LA Philharmonic as I was growing up in LA, and I heard her play all the time. And when Gary would go to Aspen and I couldn't join him at Aspen, she would be my teacher. She was actually my last teacher in LA before I went to Juilliard, and she got me prepared for orchestral. She had such an insight into all the details of playing in an orchestra, because at that time she'd already had 40 years of experience playing the LA Philharmonic. She'd been in there for 60 years when she retired, and so she really showed me the way for orchestral excerpts in a very, very detailed way. And she is one of my very best friends and colleagues, and I'm so indebted to her because one of the most recent projects that I've been working on is extremely exciting that I want to share with you, and that is the John Williams Clarinet Concerto. Was written for her, and she performed it several times in the 1990s, and she's entrusted me with the music, and I have plans to perform the John Williams Concerto with the Chicago College of Performing Arts Orchestra, and hopefully in other venues as well in the upcoming seasons.
Well, John Williams certainly knows how to write beautifully for clarinet, and so many successful movie scores involve wonderful clarinet playing. Certainly featured the great Emily Bernstein.
Right.
Bernstein played
Terminal.
The Terminal, and that piece has become, they've created a piano reduction score.
Yes.
Very popular.
Victor's Tale. Yes. Yeah. So I'm that's one of my future projects that I'm working on right now, that I'm crafting right now, and it's as a result of my friendship and being a student of Michelle's also. And interestingly enough, she was her late husband, Peter Zukovsky, was also a clarinetist, and his father was a predecessor of mine in the Chicago Symphony. Charles Zukovsky. Peter Zukovsky was Charles's father, and he was the bass clarinetist in the Chicago Symphony in the 1940s. And so there's a connection between Michelle and the Chicago Symphony because her husband came from that lineage. And that's why she plays the German system. Because in the 20s and 30s in Chicago, the principal clarinetist was Robert Lindemann, and he came from Germany, and he played the German system. So he had some students, some disciples that played German system, one of which was Peter Zukovsky, and another of which was George Weber. George Weber, who was my immediate predecessor in the Chicago Symphony. They both played on the German system instruments, and during her tenure in Los Angeles, when Michelle married Charles Zukovsky, she got interested in the German system, and that's to this day what she plays on.
I see. Okay, well, that's some interesting background there. I had no idea about any of that.
Yeah, and there was a time when Daniel Barenboim, as music director, wanted all of our clarinet players to play the German system. So we actually got German system clarinets, and I still haven't I made several recordings on them. I recorded the Hindemith Sonata, the Reger Sonata on the German system clarinets, and I'm of course a Yamaha artist, and the Yamaha company makes beautiful German system clarinets. Not only do their French system clarinets, for me, achieve the best that I've ever experienced, but their German system clarinets also are absolutely top notch. And Michelle played not only the Wurlitzers, but she had a set of Yamahas as well.
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned to you that only within the last, I guess, month or so, I ended up buying the Yamaha CSVR ASP model.
Yes.
Which is basically a takeoff on the best of the Buffet R13s. And I have been a Buffet player 90% of my life. And I was blown away. I mean, and no one, if I were playing with anyone, and no one would know it wasn't a Buffet of the best vintage of Buffet. It's that good. And believe me, as a doubler, I have 4 B-flat clarinets. I didn't need a 5th as a doubler, but it was too good. And quite frankly, I'm playing it all the time. I don't know if I'm going to be able to go back to my Buffet. Any of them.
The CSVR Yamaha is the best clarinet I've ever played, and I've been playing them now for about 7 years since they first came out, and I just love it.
Yeah, and you played the most recent model, the ASP.
The souped up version with the Atelier model. But it is very special. But the bore of the bass CSVR instrument is identical, and so I've played all of them interchangeably since I guess 2017.
Right, and you were one of the. But hadn't you played Yamahas prior to that?
Since 1990, I've been exclusively a Yamaha artist since 1990.
And first, actually, of a major U.S. Clarinet chair in one of our major orchestras. Really, maybe the first to go full time for Yamaha, as far as I recollect.
It is true.
Well,
and I'm it's because they were so attentive. It's the Yamaha. The people that work in the Yamaha design division were so interested in creating an instrument and getting feedback from the players that play them. So they'd come here every year to Chicago, and they bring new models and would have us evaluate them. And so it would be, since I came to the orchestra, they started doing that. And then finally, by 1990, they made every year incremental changes. So I said, if they're going to be so attentive and react to every comment that I have about their instruments, I think I'm going to be playing their instruments exclusively. So I have been.
Yeah. And they've done the same, by the way, for the saxophones. About 3 years ago, I purchased they were an alto saxophone of theirs that I just love. I mean, and so I've seen those changes too. And I'm probably not one who changes easily, especially from bands that I've grown up with playing my whole life. But I've been blown away, quite frankly.
Yeah. Well, they're doing something right, and it comes from listening to the artists that play their instruments on a very, very high level, and what our requirements are, and what our desires are for what an instrument can do.
Yeah, and you can see that in the way the instruments that at least I purchased and have chosen ergonomically, they're just so friendly to the hands, and especially as you get older, I need that kind of help, and even to the
I
extent.
need all the help I can get.
Yeah, exactly. And our mutual friend, the great repairman in New York here, Tomoji Hirokata.
Oh, yes.
When I was telling Tomoji recently about the fact that the weight of the instrument seems so much less, yet silver keys, it has all the same amount of keys as my buffet. And he said, well, the thumb rest, they use about whole 3 or 4 different metals. And they have so many people, he said, invested in just the thumb rest and figuring out what's the best way to do that for resonance and weight. And, I sat there with my mouth open. It's like, Jesus Christ.
Wow, that's amazing. I did not know that. Wow, that is really, yeah,
it's very
they don't leave any stone unturned.
no,
there.
and that's what it should be. And,
Absolutely.
And it's nice to see that occurring, and I'm certainly grateful. I wish it had happened 40 years ago.
Right. Well, they've had these developments. In those days, I think everybody was just resigned to the fact that you play a buffet R13, and that was it. A couple of guys played Selmers,
Right.
and but now it's like all the instrument manufacturers are coming up and paying more attention. And Yamaha is so skilled at developing instruments that they've been so successful in creating something that responds to the individual player making comments.
It's sort of like what happened with the car industry here in America. Suddenly in the 70s, 80s, people were buying Toyotas and Hondas, and the American car industry was in the tank for a while, but they had to up their game. And so now, I mean, you can get wonderful cars from anywhere.
Sure. Yeah.
It took that initial push, especially the Toyota cars, really sort of changed.
Oh yeah.
People view the making of cars.
I own for the first time since 2 years an American-made car. I've never owned anything else, but now I own an American-made car.
Yeah, and they're wonderful now. I mean, they finally, it's taken a long time, but they are there. There's no question. But it's just interesting how the parallel in approaching things. But
True.
It always takes one company to put that extra energy in, which brings us now to your other equipment, mouthpiece and reeds, and ligature, which of course all the clarinet nerds want to know about.
Well, I've been a Van Doren artist for many, many years now too. And in fact, I was going to mention that there is a book, the Van Doren Centennial book, that came out in 2005. That
Hold on.
Yeah, you probably have it. The Van Doren Centennial Etude and Exercise book that I highly recommend. And that's one of the things that I use on a regular. There it is. Yep.
I had it out and studying, of course, some of your things here, and you brought me back to Behrman, the staccato and trill exercise.
That's it. That's in there, and then and my wife Teresa has a warm up exercise in there also.
I'll just plug the other people here. My ex teacher Eddie Daniels, our ex colleague, student friend Mitch Estrin, Gary. Greg
all the
Drayton,
greats.
From the Dallas Symphony, Dave Weber. These are among the people who have contributed etudes, and it's a great book. And I I had on the shelf, and in preparing for our interview, I went back and I said, I think I remember John
Yep.
something in this book. And then for the last several weeks, I mean, this has been the major focus on my
Yep.
stand.
It's a real great resource.
Yes.
And it was something wonderful that Van Doren did to celebrate their 100th anniversary. And so, and I have to say, their reads are getting better and better all the time. I think their standards, their quality, uh, the way they package the reads, first of all, is improving all the time. And so I'm happy to use their reads on all the instruments that I play, all the way from E flat down to contrabass. And then I use the optimum ligature on all my mouthpieces. And I think it's a game changer that they came out with the Black Diamond series mouthpieces. Uh, the ones particularly I like are the BD4 and the BD5 on the B flat clarinet, and especially the BD5 on the E flat clarinet. Best mouthpiece I ever played on the E flat clarinet.
Well, John, it's been great catching up with you, and boy,
Yeah.
you still have all the energy in the world, it seems to me, and also a lot of ability and a desire to share your knowledge. And I'm sure the young folks who are studying with you at the college are the beneficiary of this. And we need more people like you in major positions, putting themselves out there, not only in the orchestral world, but in the chamber music world, as you do, playing new music and teaching and sharing your ideas with the youngsters, and just making yourself more and more available. And I think this is a trait that I think we need to impress upon others for all instruments, but certainly regarding classical music, and hopefully building back an audience so that the orchestras can sustain themselves and great music can continue to be written and heard.
Indeed. Well, Ed, I'm so glad that you're providing this service for everybody, for young musicians and experienced musicians as well. And it's delightful to be able to hear these interviews with our colleagues and our mentors, and it's a wonderful thing that you're doing for everybody. So I thank you for inviting me, and it's great to catch up and
Yeah.
to go back, relive our days ago,
Yeah.
almost 50 years ago.
Hard to believe, but
Yeah, it is. But in a way, kind of everything has kind of slipped by in a flash. But then when you think about it, there's been a lot happening.
yeah,
So
certainly. And just a little aside that you would probably more appreciate. The reason I got my website going, because I'm not a PR person. I don't like doing that stuff. I'm not a social media person. I don't do any of that. I have a Facebook page that's only professional. I don't interact on Facebook, Twitter, none of that. I'm
okay.
an anti social media person. But when our former teacher, Joe Allen, passed, and there was not a mention of him in the local union paper, local 802, there was nothing done. And I guess I forget how old I was, but it was somewhere right around 1990, 1991 that Joe passed.
Right.
And I saw there was nothing done. And this is a man who had taught
so much influence.
60 plus years and had taught thousands upon thousands of musicians, clarinet, saxophone, bass clarinet, of course, and in all styles of music, commercial, jazz, classical. I mean, nothing. And it bothered me. And it was eating at me. And finally, a number of years ago, I was doing a show with a colleague who had created a website for brass players. And where he was interviewing great brass players and thereby sort of sustaining that legacy and letting people, especially younger players, hear about, not only the specific players that he was interviewing, but about a more general framework of the way the music industry was and what others contributed, people who
Right.
you might not hear of. And so, really, Joe's passing and the way I felt like it was not honored the way it should be
Mm,
was sort of the
yeah.
impetus. And it took me a number of years to try to figure out how I could do something. And the
Well,
use of the website and then these type of interviews
yeah.
really provided that forum. And so
Pays tribute to our mentor and the legacy that they leave, and we're part of that legacy. So it is our duty to pass that on to the next generations. And I think I
yes.
appreciate what you're doing.
Well, thank you so much, and continued luck and good luck with the contra coming up and your reads on the D
Thanks.
clarinet. And
Thank you very much. I can use all the luck I can get.
you know that. All right. Well, John, thank you and take good care.
You too, Ed. Thank you so much.
Okay.